Welcome to my philosophy channel. There is a question that most of us have felt, but few of us have been able to name. Not the big philosophical questions about God or the cosmos, but the smaller, more personal one. The moment when the life you are living suddenly appears to you as if from the outside, arbitrary and strange, and you cannot quite remember how you agreed to it. Albert Camus spent his entire career trying to give that moment its proper weight. What he found there was not despair. This runs a little long. Stay until the end, and that feeling may have a different shape on the way out. Chapter 1. The Boy from Mondovi. The light in Algeria does not arrive gradually. It appears, white and total, filling everything at once, without the softening that northern climates provide by way of preparation. Under that light, in November of 1913, in a small settlement called Mondovi in the French Algerian interior, Albert Camus was born into a world that offered very little and made no particular apology for it. His father was an agricultural laborer. They owned almost nothing. The day outside was bright and hard and did not explain itself. His father, Lucien, was conscripted when Albert was less than a year old and sent to the Marne, where the first German offensive of the war was being stopped at extraordinary cost. Lucien died there in October 1914 with a piece of shrapnel in his skull. Albert had not yet formed a memory of his face. There was nothing to grieve in the way that grief requires a presence first, only an absence that had been there since the beginning, shaping the room it occupied by the precise dimensions of what was not in it. Catherine Camus brought her 2 boys to her mother's apartment in the Bellecourt district of Algiers. 2 rooms, no running water, no electricity, no books on the shelves because there were no shelves. Catherine had suffered a stroke in childhood that left her nearly deaf, with a speech impediment that made extended conversation slow and painful. She worked as a charwoman. She came home in the evenings and sat in her chair and said very little. And Albert watched her face in the way that children watch the faces of people who cannot give them everything they need through words. He learned to read what could not be said, to find meaning in posture, in stillness, in the angle at which a person holds their head when the world has taken enough from them that they have stopped expecting it to offer more. He also grew up with the Mediterranean behind the city, that enormous, self-contained blue that does not explain itself and does not need to. He swam in it when the heat allowed. He played goalkeeper for his neighborhood football club, quick and attentive in the bright Algerian afternoon, with a quality of happiness that belongs specifically to people who have never been given the luxury of assuming they are owed it. At 17, tuberculosis arrived. It would never entirely leave. It removed him from the pitch eventually, and later from military service, and it kept death close enough throughout his adult life to be felt rather than merely understood. A weight in the lungs when the air turned cold. A reminder that the body has its own timeline and consults no one. Some people respond to that kind of knowledge by looking away from it. Camus looked at it directly, and then he kept looking at everything else with the same attention, as though the proximity of the end made the present moment worth examining more carefully than it would otherwise deserve. He was still in secondary school when a teacher named Louis Germain noticed something in him that the neighborhood had no infrastructure for developing. Germain paid out of his own pocket to prepare the boy for the competitive lycée scholarship examination, the exam that would determine whether a child from Bellecourt could continue his education or leave school at 11 and enter the labor his father never lived long enough to grow old performing. Camus passed. He left Bellecourt for the lycée then for the University of Algiers, then for journalism, then for the world. When the Nobel Prize in Literature was announced in October of 1957, he was still 43. One of his first acts was to sit down and write a private letter to Germain, the old teacher who had paid for the materials, who had extended a hand to a small poor child and not explained the gesture in terms of charity or duty, but simply as one person recognizing what another person was capable of. Camus told him that without that hand, none of what followed would have been possible. By the time he sat in Stockholm that December, surrounded by everything a boy from a two-room apartment in Belcourt was not supposed to reach, he was 44, and he thought of a classroom in Algiers. What he carried forward from Algeria was not resentment, though the circumstances might reasonably have produced it. It was something harder to account for, a nearly physical love for the fact of being alive. The light, the sea, the smell of salt and dust in the afternoon. These were not consolations. They were not poetry. They were the original data from which his philosophy would eventually be built. The world is beautiful, and the world is silent. And both of these things are true simultaneously, and neither one cancels the other out. The argument would come later, in essays and novels written during war and occupation, and the slow accumulation of everything that the century was determined to prove about human cruelty. But the beginning of the argument was simpler and more physical than any of that. A boy in Belcourt, the Mediterranean behind the city, a pair of goalkeeper's gloves on a concrete pitch. The sensation, available to anyone who has been poor enough and young enough and close enough to the sea, that being alive is, in itself, an extraordinary event that requires no additional justification. Everything Camus would ever write can be traced back to that sensation, to the child who learned silence from a mother who could not easily speak, who learned about absence from a father he never met, and who ran toward the water anyway, because the water was there, and the afternoon was long, and there was nothing in the world that had yet told him he should not. Chapter 2. The Stranger at the Door. A telegram on a table. 5 words, or something close to 5 words, informing a man in Algiers that his mother has died at the nursing home where she has been living, and he is not entirely sure whether she died today or yesterday. He reads the telegram. He makes the necessary arrangements to attend the funeral. He does not weep. The novel begins there, in that flat and factual space, and it is already doing something that most novels do not do. Refusing to perform the emotion the moment conventionally requires. Mother died today, or maybe yesterday, I don't know. This is the opening of L'Étranger, published in 1942, and it remains one of the most disorienting first sentences in modern literature. Not because the language is difficult or the situation extraordinary, but because of what is absent from it. There is no grief. There is no tenderness. There is no retrospective assembling of the mother into someone the reader is invited to mourn. There is only a man who does not know the date and has written it down exactly as it is. His name is Meursault. He is a clerk in a shipping office in Algiers. He attends his mother's funeral in the full heat of an Algerian summer, and he does not ask to see the body, and he does not cry during the vigil, and he smokes a cigarette because he wants one. Afterward, he returns to Algiers and begins a relationship with a woman named Marie and agrees, without much interest, to help his neighbor Raymond with a scheme that will eventually carry them both to a beach in the afternoon heat, where a confrontation has been waiting to resolve itself in the worst possible direction. The shooting happens slowly, the way violent things happen in Camus. Not with the dramatic speed of thrillers, but with the terrible, incremental logic of a moment that has been building under the surface for longer than anyone admitted. The sun is enormous. The light off the Arab man's knife is blinding. Meursault has already turned back once, but something in the heat and the glare and the accumulated weight of the afternoon presses him forward. He fires once. There is a pause, the kind that the novel holds open with a precision that feels almost cruel. Then he fires 4 more times. He cannot explain it later. Not because he is concealing the truth, but because the truth, as he experienced it, was not a decision. It was a capitulation to circumstances, to sun and heat, and the specific quality of an afternoon that had already gone too far in one direction. The courtroom does not accept this. The courtroom requires a motive it can recognize, a narrative it can follow, a man who knew what he was doing, and can therefore be held responsible for it within the terms of the story that courts need crime to tell. What the prosecution builds instead is a character. They call witnesses who describe Meursault's behavior at his mother's funeral, that he did not weep, that he smoked, that he returned to Algiers and began a relationship the following day. A prosecutor stands before the court and argues that a man who could attend his mother's funeral without showing appropriate grief is capable of any crime. Meursault listens to this argument, and somewhere in the listening he begins to understand what is actually on trial. At the legal surface, the shooting on the beach is on trial. But at the deeper social level, what the court truly punishes is his failure to perform. The performance that society requires is not difficult to identify once Meursault has made its absence visible. It asks that we display emotions on schedule, that we construct our inner lives into coherent narratives that others can follow and approve, that we speak about loss in the registers that loss is supposed to use. What it cannot tolerate is the person who experiences grief differently, or on a different timeline, or not at all, who refuses to produce the expected text over an internal experience that does not match it. This refusal is what makes Meursault a criminal in the court's deepest sense, not the shooting, the silence before and after it. In his cell waiting, a prison chaplain comes to offer the consolations that religion has always offered at the edge of execution. The framework that transforms death into transition, that provides suffering with a destination, that asks only for belief in exchange for the removal of finality. Meursault refuses. He refuses with a passion that surprises even him, that rises up from somewhere below the habitual detachment that has characterized him throughout the novel. He does not want the chaplain's certainties. He prefers the thing as it is. The cell, the sky visible through the small window, the fact of his ending approached without decoration. In the last pages, something opens in him. He lets go of hope, and what he finds beneath it is not despair but a strange, flat clarity, what he calls the gentle indifference of the world. The universe is not against him. It is simply not for him either. It has no position on his life or his death, and this indifference, which might have felt like abandonment, feels instead like a kind of kinship. He and the world are alike in this, neither of them performing, neither of them pretending. He opens himself to it, and the novel ends. In the same year, Camus would publish the essay that gave philosophical language to what the novel had already dramatized. But L'étranger does not need the explanation to work. It works through the telegram on the table and the sun on the beach and the chaplain in the doorway and the small rectangle of sky above a man who decided, in the end, that honesty was worth more than comfort. Some readers come to Camus through the philosophy. Many more come through this, through a character who could not lie about what he felt and paid the specific price that a world built on performed feeling charges to those who will not pay it. Chapter 3. The Fundamental Question. There is a particular kind of mourning that most people have experienced at least once. A mourning indistinguishable from any other in its physical facts. The alarm, the light through the curtains, the smell of coffee beginning in the kitchen. And yet, something is different. The machinery of the day that usually starts automatically does not start. You are lying in bed looking at the ceiling, and the thought arrives, not dramatically, not with any announcement. Why am I doing any of this? Not as depression, not as crisis, just as a genuine question that the morning has somehow failed to answer before asking. Camus opens The Myth of Sisyphus, published in the same year as The Stranger, with a sentence that takes that morning seriously. There is but one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. He does not mean this as provocation. He means it with the precision of someone who has decided to follow an argument wherever it leads, regardless of whether the destination is comfortable. If the question of whether life is worth living is genuine, if it is not simply a symptom to be treated, but a real philosophical problem, then it deserves a real philosophical answer, and the answer cannot be assumed in advance. The essay is an attempt to provide that answer without cheating. The cheat would be to begin with the conclusion: life is meaningful, consciousness is valuable, the future holds something worth waiting for, and then construct arguments backward to support it. Camus refuses this. He begins instead with what he calls the absurd, and he defines it with a care that the word's casual use in conversation rarely reflects. The absurd is not a quality of the world. It is not a quality of the human mind. It exists in the collision between them. On one side, the human being who carries an apparently inextinguishable need for clarity, for order, for the sense that existence has a direction, and that direction means something. We want to know why we are here. We want the arc of our lives to resolve into something coherent. We want the universe to respond to us, not necessarily with kindness, but with comprehension, with some signal that the question has been received. This wanting is not a defect or an immaturity to be grown out of. It is structural. It is what human consciousness, by its nature, does. On the other side, the world which maintains a silence so complete that it cannot even be called deliberate. There is no withholding. There is no cruelty in the silence. The universe does not refuse to answer because it has decided not to. It is silent in the way that stone is silent, in the way that light is silent, with the thoroughness of something that simply does not have the capacity to respond. The human being speaks into this silence with every question philosophy has ever asked about meaning and purpose and justice, and the silence comes back unchanged. The absurd is born in the gap between these two things. Not in the human need alone, not in the world's silence alone, in the confrontation. Take away either term, and the absurd dissolves. Kill yourself, and there is no one left to feel the contradiction. Adopt a belief system that claims to have the answers, and the silence is papered over with something that resembles response. But hold both terms open simultaneously. Keep the need and the silence present at the same time. Look directly at both without flinching from either, and you are living inside the absurd. Camus illustrates what this feels like through images that stay with the reader long after the argument has been processed. He describes a man in a telephone booth, visible through glass, speaking with intensity and animation, his face moving through expressions of urgency and appeal, and then the sound is cut. Without the words, the performance becomes incomprehensible. The gestures that were communication become pantomime. The man is still clearly a man, clearly speaking, clearly wanting to be understood. But the understanding has been removed. And what remains is the strangeness of a creature performing meaning in a world that has stopped transmitting it. He describes the routine that most working lives follow: rising, the transport to work, 4 hours in an office or a factory, a meal, the return, 4 more hours, sleep, then Monday again and Tuesday, and the week accumulating into years, accumulating into a life, and somewhere in the middle of it, a moment of pause, in which the whole structure becomes visible as a structure, as something that was built, that could have been built differently. That is not the natural order of things, but a particular arrangement that was agreed to, without the agreement ever being quite explicit. This is the moment Camus is interested in. Not the routine itself, but the pause in which the routine becomes strange. Most people, when this pause arrives, close it as quickly as possible. They return to the routine. They add something to it, a new project, a new relationship, a new conviction, that restores the sense of purpose the pause had temporarily removed. Camus does not judge this. He simply notes that the closure is chosen, that the reassuring narrative is constructed rather than found, and that the act of construction leaves something unaddressed beneath it. The question does not go away because the morning becomes busy again. What distinguishes the philosophical response from the ordinary one is the refusal to close the pause prematurely, to sit with the question, to resist the available answers long enough to examine whether they actually answer it, or simply replace it with something more comfortable. This sitting with is what the myth of Sisyphus attempts to model. Not an arrival at peace, not a resolution, but a sustained engagement with the discomfort of the genuine question. It is an uncomfortable essay to read because it is performing the thing it describes, holding the silence open and refusing to fill it on false terms. There is something else in the essay that its opening gambit tends to obscure. Camus is not a man writing from a distance about a problem he has diagnosed in others. He is writing from inside the problem. The tuberculosis that arrived at 17 had given him a physical relationship with mortality that most philosophers who write about death have only approached theoretically. The war, which was ongoing when he was writing, had demonstrated what human beings were willing to do to each other when the usual structures of meaning were stripped away or replaced by ideology. The absurd was not an intellectual exercise. It was the description of a world he was actually living in, arriving at his conclusions by the pressure of circumstances as much as by the movement of argument. The fundamental question, then, is not really about suicide in the clinical sense. It is about whether the honest recognition of the world's silence makes authentic life impossible. Whether, once you have seen the gap, you can still choose to build a life inside it without lying about the foundations. Camus believed you could. The rest of the essay is his attempt to show how. Chapter 4, The Three Escapes. Picture a long corridor with 3 doors. Each door is unlocked. Each one opens onto a different version of the same promise: that the tension you are carrying, the gap between what you need from the world and what the world provides, can be resolved. That the question does not have to remain a question. That somewhere through one of these doors, the problem ends. Camus spent the central chapters of the myth of Sisyphus walking toward each door in turn, opening it carefully, and explaining in precise and patient terms why what lies behind it is not what it claims to be. The first door is the most literal. Physical suicide resolves the absurd by eliminating the consciousness that experiences it. If the collision between human need and the world's silence is unbearable, one can simply remove the human side of the equation. The argument has a logical surface. If life's meaninglessness makes it not worth living, then ending the life is the consistent response. Camus takes this argument seriously enough to spend considerable time with it, because taking it seriously is the only way to genuinely answer it. He does not dismiss it as morbidity or pathology. His answer is this: suicide is not a solution to the absurd, but a surrender to one of its terms. We feel the absurd because we care enormously about meaning, about consciousness, about the texture and weight of being alive. The unbearableness of the silence is evidence of how much the human side of the equation wants to be here, wants to understand, wants the question answered. To respond to that wanting by eliminating the one who wants it is to destroy the very thing whose existence created the problem. It solves nothing. It dissolves everything that was worth preserving in the attempt to preserve it. There is also this: the person who discovers the absurd and considers suicide is already in revolt. They are already refusing to accept the silence as sufficient. They are already insisting that existence should offer more than it currently does. This insistence is the beginning of the only authentic response Camus recognizes. To follow it toward death is to mistake the argument's direction, to walk through the first door when the whole of the corridor still remains. The second door is more crowded. Behind it stand philosophers, theologians, and a great many ordinary people who have encountered the silence and decided to fill it with something louder than the evidence supports. Camus calls this philosophical suicide, and he identifies it with a precision that disturbed many of his contemporaries. The leap of faith, Kierkegaard's term for the move from recognizing life's absurdity to embracing religious belief as its resolution, is, for Camus, an act of intellectual self-betrayal. The leap does not answer the absurd. It changes the subject. What makes this form of evasion more interesting than simple denial is that it begins honestly. The existentialist thinkers Camus is engaging, Kierkegaard, Jaspers, some of the phenomenologists, arrive at the absurd through genuine philosophical rigor. They see the gap between human need and cosmic silence. They feel its weight. And then, at the exact moment where honest thought would require sitting with the discomfort, they jump toward God, toward transcendence, toward some structure that promises to bridge the gap by assuring the questioner that there is an answer on the other side, even if it cannot be seen from here. Camus finds this unforgivable, not morally but intellectually. He calls it deifying what crushes them. He is careful not to attack religious belief as such. The person who has always lived within faith, who has never stood at the edge of the silence and felt its full extent, is not his subject. What he is examining is the philosopher who reasons their way to the edge and then turns back, who uses the very intelligence that exposed the problem to justify abandoning it. This, he argues, is the most sophisticated form of dishonesty available to a thinking person. It wears the clothes of courage while performing a retreat. Political ideologies function the same way. The revolutionary who believes history is moving inevitably toward justice. The progressive who trusts that reason and reform will eventually solve the human problem. Each of these positions takes the shape of the absurd seriously, and then offers a narrative that dissolves it. The narrative says, yes, the present is chaotic and painful and without guarantee, but the future will redeem it. Hold on. Keep working. The meaning is coming. Camus recognizes the genuine compassion that often motivates these beliefs. He also recognizes that they are asking us to live in relation to a future that does not yet exist, at the expense of a present that does. The third door is the one that people who pride themselves on clear-sightedness sometimes choose. A third temptation, though less a formal category in Camus than a modern name for a related danger, is nihilism. It accepts that life is meaningless, and then treats this acceptance as a philosophy rather than a condition. It says, "Since nothing matters, I will act as if nothing matters. Since there are no values, I will pretend to value nothing." Camus has little patience for this. Nihilism, he argues, preserves the conclusion of the absurd while abandoning the tension that produced it. The person who genuinely feels that nothing matters is already inside the experience of caring. They feel the absence of meaning precisely because they wanted meaning to be there. To then perform indifference is to lie about the interior experience that the philosophy was supposed to be describing. All three doors, then, open onto the same evasion. Each one resolves the tension by eliminating one of its terms. Physical suicide removes the human. The leap of faith removes the silence by claiming it is not silence, but unheard music. Nihilism removes the human need by pretending it was never there. Camus steps back from all three and returns to the corridor. The harder thing, the only honest thing, in his account, is to remain exactly there. Between the need and the silence, in full knowledge of both, and to decide what to do with that knowledge before another morning makes the question unavoidable again. Chapter 5. 3 Words for a Life. What remains, once the three doors have been closed, is not emptiness. This is the move that most readers of Camus miss, or arrive at too late. The assumption that a philosophy which rejects God, rejects hope, and rejects the comfort of historical inevitability must end in a kind of gray and featureless stoicism, a life of joyless endurance at a respectful distance from everything that might hurt. The myth of Sisyphus is not that book. What remains after the rejections is something closer to the opposite of diminishment. Camus names it in 3 words: revolt, freedom, passion. They arrive in the essay not as a program or a prescription, but as consequences. Things that follow logically and inevitably from the decision to live inside the absurd without closing it. He does not present them as virtues to be cultivated or goals to be achieved. They are what happens to a person who has genuinely accepted the situation, and then, with that acceptance still present, decided to continue. They are the shape that authentic life takes when it stops pretending. Revolt is the first and most fundamental. It is also the most easily misunderstood, because the word carries associations of noise, of barricades, of the raised fist against a specific and identifiable enemy. Camus means something quieter and more constant. Revolt is the daily refusal to be crushed by what cannot be changed. It is the posture of a person who knows exactly what their situation is, knows the silence, knows the gap, knows the finitude of everything they are building, and who, knowing all of this, continues to engage. It does not require an opponent. It does not require a victory. It requires only the ongoing choice to face the situation, rather than retreat from it into either despair or false comfort. There is a specific quality to this kind of revolt that distinguishes it from resignation wearing revolt's clothes. Resignation says, "The situation is what it is, and I have accepted it, and I will now be quiet about it." Revolt says, "The situation is what it is, I see it fully, I refuse to pretend otherwise, and I am choosing to be here anyway." The difference is in the quality of the seeing. Resignation looks away after accepting. Revolt keeps looking, keeps the tension alive, keeps the question open, keeps the human side of the collision in active contact with the silence, rather than settled into comfortable coexistence with a softened version of it. Freedom follows from revolt in a way that initially seems counterintuitive. A person who has acknowledged that life is without ultimate meaning and without external justification might be expected to feel more constrained, not less, stripped of the guiding frameworks that usually tell people which choices matter and which do not. Camus inverts this. When the future loses its power to threaten, when there is no divine judgment to be feared, no historical verdict to be awaited, no cosmic ledger in which the significance of our choices will eventually be tallied, the present opens. Every choice is a choice. Every commitment is freely made rather than owed to something that stands outside the self and demands it. This freedom is not the freedom of the person who believes anything goes. Camus is precise about this. Freedom without limits is simply another form of evasion. The nihilist's freedom, which performs liberation while actually abandoning the very consciousness that makes freedom meaningful. The freedom that follows from the absurd is the freedom of full responsibility. There is no authority to appeal to, which means there is no authority to blame. The shape of a life is chosen, and the choosing is visible to the person doing it, and there is nothing standing between the person and the consequences of their choice. This is frightening. It is also, Camus argues, the only kind of freedom that is not secretly a form of dependence. Passion completes the triad, and it is perhaps the most surprising of the three, the most resistant to the gray stoicism that readers sometimes project onto the philosophy. Passion, in Camus's sense, is not romantic intensity or emotional excess. It is the preference for quantity of experience over quality of significance. The person who lives without appeal, who has let go of the hope that their choices are pointing somewhere beyond themselves, is free to experience the present more completely than the person who is always measuring it against a future destination. Every conversation, every meal, every afternoon of light on water, none of these is preparation for anything. Each is the thing itself, available in full. He gives 4 figures as examples of the absurd life lived with passion. The seducer, who pursues the experience of connection across many encounters rather than accumulating them into a single, definitive relationship. The actor, who lives dozens of different lives in compressed form across a career, each one complete and then released. The conqueror, who commits entirely to a political struggle in full knowledge that the struggle will not be finally won. And the artist. It is the artist who comes closest to the absurd ideal, and the reason is specific. The artist creates worlds, entire structures of meaning and experience, without claiming that those worlds explain the one the rest of us are living in. The painting is not a solution to the problem of the painting. The novel is not a proof. The music is not an argument. Each is a thing made with complete commitment and offered without metaphysical guarantees, which is precisely the gesture Camus is asking all of us to make with the whole of our lives. There is a sentence in the essay that readers often pass too quickly. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. It appears at the end, as a conclusion, and the temptation is to read it as a kind of wry consolation, the philosopher's way of making the best of a bad situation. But revolt, freedom, and passion arrive before that sentence, and they change what the sentence means. Sisyphus is not happy despite the boulder, or in spite of the boulder, or by performing happiness over the boulder. He is happy in the specific way that a person is happy when they have stopped lying about their situation and started inhabiting it fully. When the revolt and the freedom and the passion have replaced the pretending, and what is left is not joy in the sentimental sense, but something more durable and more honest. 3 words. Not a program, not a promise, not a set of instructions. A description of what it looks like when a person has genuinely accepted the situation, and then, rather than looking for the exit, decided to live in it as completely as possible. The corridor with the 3 closed doors is behind them. What is ahead is not a destination. It is the ongoing fact of being alive. In this specific world, with these specific limitations, on this particular morning, and the choice, available again, to face it directly. Chapter 6. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. Consider the moment at the top of the mountain. Not the arrival. That is too brief and too shadowed by what follows to constitute a moment in the full sense. Consider instead the pause after the arrival. Sisyphus, standing at the summit with his hands on the stone at rest. The view extending outward in all directions over a landscape that has watched this happen before and will watch it happen again. The gods designed the punishment to strip everything away. Purpose, progress, the comfort of accumulation. What they could not design away was the pause, and it is in the pause, Camus tells us, that Sisyphus interests him. The stone rolls back. This is the part of the myth that most tellings spend the longest with. The cruelty of the reversal, the boulder undoing in seconds what the body spent hours achieving. Camus barely pauses on it. The stone going down is not the story. The story is the descent that follows, when Sisyphus walks back to the bottom to begin again. That walk, measured, unhurried, the body moving downward through the same air it moved upward through, is what the essay is actually about. It is described as that hour like a breathing space which returns as surely as his suffering. That is the hour of consciousness. Consciousness is the word Camus centers everything on. Sisyphus knows. He has no illusions about what awaits him at the bottom. None about what will happen when he reaches the top again. The gods assumed that this knowledge would constitute the punishment, that the full visibility of the futility would be what broke him. What they miscalculated is that consciousness cuts in multiple directions. Yes, it makes the futility visible. It also makes everything else visible. The weight of the stone as something familiar, the slope as something known, the summit as something achieved, however briefly, by genuine effort. Consciousness does not only illuminate what is missing, it illuminates what is there. The comparison Camus draws to modern life is one of the essay's most quietly devastating passages. The workman of today works every day in his life at the same tasks, and this fate is no less absurd. He is not being poetic. He means it as a direct observation. The person who commutes the same route, performs the same operations, returns to the same apartment, and wakes to do it again is pushing a boulder. The difference between them and Sisyphus is not the nature of the labor, but the degree of consciousness brought to it. Sisyphus, in Camus's reading, has achieved something that most people doing equivalent labor have not. He has seen his situation clearly and kept going anyway, which means that his return to the stone is a choice rather than a habit. This is what separates the absurd hero from the ordinary person trapped in routine. The ordinary person continues because they have not fully confronted the question of whether to continue. Because the alarm rings and the body responds, and the day begins before the mind has been consulted about whether it agrees. Sisyphus continues after consultation. He descends with full knowledge of what the descent means, which transforms the descent into something the gods cannot take credit for designing. The punishment was designed to be endured. Instead, it has become inhabited, which is a different relationship entirely. His rock is his thing. This is the line that carries the most weight in the final pages of the essay, and it carries it quietly, without announcement. Possession in the ordinary sense is not what Camus means. The rock belongs to Sisyphus not as property, but as the specific material of his engagement with existence. The thing that his body knows, that his effort has a relationship with, that his particular life has been organized around in the way that all lives are organized around something. Most of them without choosing it as deliberately as Sisyphus has been forced to choose his. There is a freedom in this ownership that looks nothing like freedom from the outside. From the outside, it looks like eternal punishment. From the inside, having accepted it completely, it is the only thing that is entirely his. The comparison to Meursault in the final pages of L'Étranger is not one Camus draws explicitly, but it is embedded in both texts for anyone reading them together. Meursault in his cell, after refusing the chaplain's consolations, arrives at something very close to what Camus describes in Sisyphus descending. He opens himself to the gentle indifference of the world, lets go of the appeal, the hope that existence owes him an explanation, and finds beneath it not despair, but a strange, flat peace. Both figures have arrived at the same place by different routes. The full acceptance of their situation as their situation, without the softening that false hope or religious consolation would provide. Both have stopped negotiating with the terms and started inhabiting them. The happiness that Camus imagines for Sisyphus is not happiness as ordinarily described, not joy, not satisfaction, not the feeling that things have worked out. It is closer to what a person feels in the moments of complete absorption in a task, when the question of whether the task is ultimately meaningful has become temporarily irrelevant because the task itself has taken up all available attention. Climbers report this. Musicians report this. Surgeons. Anyone who has ever been so completely inside an activity that the usual running commentary of the mind, "Is this worth it? Where is it going? What does it mean?" has briefly stopped. Sisyphus at the Boulder, if we follow Camus's reading, lives entirely in this state. Not because he has achieved transcendence, but because he has given up expecting it and found that what remains without the expectation is enough. This is the most difficult move in the entire essay, and Camus knows it. He does not soften it. Imagining Sisyphus happy is not a comfortable instruction. It asks the reader to genuinely consider whether happiness, understood as the quality of conscious engagement with one's actual situation, rather than as the feeling that the situation is good, might be available in conditions that look from the outside like pure suffering. It asks whether the person who has accepted the silence, who has stopped requiring the universe to answer and started being present to what the universe actually offers, might be living more fully than the person who still believes the answer is coming. The boulder will be at the bottom of the hill again by morning. Sisyphus knows this as he descends, with the particular knowledge of someone who has learned the specific weight of a specific stone on a specific slope under specific conditions. Learned it the way a craftsman learns a material, through repeated contact over time. The gods watch from above. The rock sits at the bottom, waiting, and Sisyphus walks down toward it with a measured step, neither hurrying nor resisting, carrying in the descending walk everything that the essay has been building toward. The revolt that faces the situation, the freedom that exists when the future has been released, and the passion that belongs to a person who has decided that this particular life, in this particular world, with this particular stone, is the one they are going to live, completely, honestly, without appeal, and with whatever happiness that kind of honesty makes possible. Chapter 7. The City Under Plague. The rats come first. This is important. the order of it. They come up from the basements and the drains in the Algerian port city of Oran, emerging into the streets and the staircases in increasing numbers, dying in the open where they can be seen. The residents of Oran step around the bodies on their way to work and remark on the strangeness of it and continue to their offices. Because the human capacity for absorbing strange information into ordinary routine is considerably larger than most emergencies require. The rats come and die, and the city steps around them and goes about its business. Then people begin to fall ill. The symptoms are specific: swollen glands, high fever, the particular quality of pain that belongs to a body fighting something it cannot identify. The doctors in Oran are cautious about the word they are approaching. It is a word that belongs to another century, to a time before modern medicine and sanitation had relegated it to history books and cautionary tales. The word sits in their mouths, and they do not say it until they have to, and then they say it: plague. The gates of the city close shortly after. The trains stop running. The letters that go out are censored. Oran is sealed, and what is inside it stays inside, and what is outside stays outside. And the residents stand at the windows and look at a horizon they can no longer cross. La Peste was published in 1947, 5 years after L'Étranger and The Myth of Sisyphus, and it represents the moment when Camus's philosophy stops being primarily a private matter. The absurd, as he had explored it through Meursault and through Sisyphus, was ultimately a condition of individual consciousness. One person, alone with the silence, working out how to inhabit it honestly. The plague changes the terms. It asks what the philosophy looks like when the silence descends not on one person but on an entire city, when the suffering is not chosen or personal but simply present, distributed without criteria across the whole of a sealed population. What does revolt mean when there is nothing specific to revolt against? What does solidarity mean when everyone is already inside the same walls? Dr. Rieu is the novel's narrator, though he conceals this until the final pages, and the concealment is itself a statement about the kind of attention the book requires. He is not narrating his own drama. He is recording what happened, the cases he treated, the conversations he had, the deaths he witnessed, and the ones he could not prevent, with the focused, slightly impersonal quality of someone who understands that the record matters more than the recorder. He works through the epidemic without claiming that his work will defeat it. He knows the plague has its own timeline, that it will end when it ends, that the individual doctor's effort is a small and probably insufficient thing against the scale of what has arrived in Oran. He works anyway, every day, with the full attention he would bring to a single patient, applied to an accumulation of patients that exceeds what a single doctor should reasonably be asked to carry. This is what Camus means by the absurd hero in collective form, not the dramatic gesture, not the speech from the barricade, but the person who continues performing their particular function in the presence of overwhelming evidence that the function is insufficient. Rieu is not a saint. He is not without fatigue or doubt or the specific grief that accumulates in a person who witnesses a great deal of dying without becoming numb to it. What he is consistently is present. He shows up. He does the work that is in front of him without requiring the work to mean something beyond itself. In this, he is Sisyphus in a hospital coat, not because his labor is futile, but because he has separated the value of the labor from the question of whether it will succeed. Father Paneloux stands at the other end of the novel's moral landscape, and Camus treats him with a care that prevents him from becoming a simple counterexample. In his first sermon after the plague is declared, Panelu tells his congregation that what has come to Oran is God's judgment, that the epidemic has meaning, that the suffering serves a purpose within a divine architecture that exceeds human understanding. He is sincere. He is also, Camus shows us, performing the leap that the myth of Sisyphus described, taking a situation of genuine horror and filling it with narrative so that the horror becomes bearable by becoming purposeful. The congregation listens. The plague continues. What changes Panelu is a child, a small boy dying in the hospital in the specific agony of the plague's later stages, his body doing what bodies do when infected in this particular way, slowly, visibly, without dignity, without the redemptive arc that suffering is supposed to have when it is meaningful. Panelu stands beside the bed and watches and says nothing. His second sermon, delivered weeks later, is a different document entirely. He does not retract the first, but the certainty has left it. He speaks now of mystery, of darkness, of the obligation to remain present to suffering, even when the suffering cannot be explained. He has moved from the priest at the pulpit to the priest at the bedside. And the distance between those two positions is the distance between a philosophy that explains suffering and a philosophy that endures it. Taru keeps notebooks. He records what he sees with the particular attention of someone who has decided that bearing witness is the most honest thing available to him in a sealed city full of dying people. He is also, among the novel's characters, the one who asks the most difficult question, not about the plague, but about the ordinary world that exists when the plague is not there. He asks what it means to be innocent. In a world where everyone is implicated in systems that produce suffering, where the machinery of ordinary life is built on arrangements that harm people at a distance, the plague makes the harm visible and immediate. But Taru suggests it was always there. The quarantine has not changed the moral situation of the residents of Oran. It has only removed their ability to look elsewhere. The solidarity that emerges in Oran is not built on shared belief or common ideology. The people who form the sanitation teams, who stay in the hospital wards past the point where staying is reasonable, who continue to move through the city, performing whatever small functions they can. They do not agree about God or politics, or the meaning of the epidemic. They agree about nothing except the fact of being inside the walls together, and the practical consequence that follows from that fact. If the suffering is to be reduced at all, it will be reduced by the people who are here. This is solidarity stripped to its minimum, not love in the full sense, not the solidarity of shared vision, but the solidarity of shared location and the responsibilities that location, in extremity, turns out to generate. The plague eventually ends, not because it was defeated, but because its cycle completed. The gates open, the trains run again. The city returns to the business of being a city in the way that cities return to business, not all at once, and not without the weight of what happened still present in the specific faces of the people who survived, and the specific absences of the people who did not. Rieu stands at a window and watches the city celebrate and feels what he feels, which the novel renders with the same plainness it has used throughout. Not joy exactly, but something that remains after the thing that was asked of him has been given. He has been a witness. He has done the work. He has not pretended that the work was sufficient, or that the outcome was fair, or that what was lost is recoverable. A window sealed with tape. A doctor's bag set by a door at 5 a.m. A priest at a bedside, saying nothing, which is the most honest thing he has ever said. These are the images the novel leaves. Not victory, not resolution. The gates are open, and the plague is in its history. And somewhere in the bacillus that caused it the capacity to return is already waiting, patient, indifferent, carrying no particular grudge against Oran. Rio knows this. He writes it down. The record is what remains when the emergency is over, and the record is offered not as consolation but as evidence that the people were here, that they did what they could, that this matters even in the absence of any authority that can confirm how much. Chapter 8. I rebel, therefore we exist. There is a question that the myth of Sisyphus leaves open, and Camus knew it was open when he left it. If the universe is indifferent to human value, if there is no God, no historical necessity, no cosmic ledger in which our choices are weighed and recorded, then what precisely is wrong with murder? The absurd, strictly followed, seems to say that one action is as valid as any other, that the man who heals and the man who kills are operating in the same moral vacuum, that the difference between them is preference rather than principle. This is the question. The Rebel, published in 1951, sets out to answer without cheating. The answer Camus arrives at does not come from above. It does not descend from God or from natural law or from a theory of human nature elaborated in the quiet of a study and then applied to the world. It comes from below, from the most elementary human gesture available, the one that precedes all philosophy and all ideology and all the elaborate structures that centuries of thinking have built over the top of it. It comes from the moment when a person says no. The slave who refuses a particular order, not all orders, not in the name of a program or a manifesto, but this specific order, which has crossed a line the slave recognizes without having previously articulated it, is performing the founding act of Camus's ethics. The no contains, necessarily, a yes. To refuse something is to assert that something else matters more. To say this treatment is unacceptable is to claim, implicitly, that there is a way of treating a person that would be acceptable, that there is a standard, however unarticulated, however discovered, in the act of violation, rather than known in advance, against which the unacceptable can be measured. What Camus notices is that this standard, when examined, does not belong only to the individual who has been violated. The slave who rebels is not claiming special privileges. They are not saying, I, specifically, deserve better than this. They are saying, a person in this situation deserves better than this. The revolt reaches past the personal grievance towards something that applies to anyone in the equivalent position. The no, once spoken honestly, cannot be spoken for oneself alone. It speaks for every human being who shares the condition that made the violation possible. I rebel, therefore we exist. This is the sentence that marks the distance Camus has traveled from Descartes' famous formulation. Descartes, alone in his room, reasoning toward the one thing he could not doubt, arrived at the individual cogito, I think, therefore, I am. Camus begins in a different room, at a different temperature, with a slave rather than a philosopher. And what the slave's refusal reveals is not the solitude of individual consciousness, but the connection that precedes it. The rebel discovers, in the act of rebellion, that they are not alone. The values they are asserting are shared values. The humanity they are defending is shared humanity. The we is not added to the rebellion from the outside. It was inside the no from the beginning. This movement, from individual revolt to shared solidarity, is not an argument Camus is making so much as a description of what actually happens when people rebel authentically. The civil rights activist who refuses to give up a seat on a bus is not only refusing for themselves. The worker who will not accept dangerous conditions is not only protecting their own body, The writer who will not sign a document they know to be false is not only preserving their own integrity. Each of these acts contains a universal claim that dignity matters, that safety matters, that truth matters, not as preferences, but as conditions of recognizably human existence. The rebellion cannot be genuine without this universalizing tendency. But Camus is not finished. He has found an ethical foundation, the shared human value that rebellion reveals, and now he turns to examine what happens when rebellion forgets where it came from. The rebel who begins with a specific no, grounded in specific suffering, in specific violation, can become something else across time. Can begin to believe they know not only what they are against, but what the world should finally look like. Can begin to treat the distance between the current world and the envisioned one as a space that justifies crossing limits that the original rebellion was designed to protect. Can begin, in short, to reproduce the logic of the thing they set out to oppose. The ethics Camus extracts from rebellion is therefore self-limiting by necessity. It must contain, built into its structure, a resistance to its own excess. The rebel cannot pursue their cause by treating actual living people as material for a future that does not yet exist. Cannot justify present murder by appeal to future liberation. Cannot claim that the end they are working toward is so good that the means used to approach it are exempt from the moral standards the rebellion itself established. This is the limit that rebellion must keep returning to. The memory of the original no, the slave who refused a specific violation, the assertion that a person in this situation deserves better than this. The person standing in front of the rebel right now is also a person in a situation. What they deserve does not depend on which side of the coming transformation they stand on. The Mediterranean figures in this part of the rebel in a way that is easy to miss on first reading. Against the continental European tendency, the German idealism that sacrifices the present to the absolute, the Marxist historical consciousness that locates justice always in the future. Camus positions the Mediterranean sense of limits. The sea knows where it ends. The sun illuminates rather than consumes. There is a tradition in the cultures that ring that particular body of water, however imperfectly realized and however often violated, of working within the scale of the human rather than against it, measure rather than excess, the specific rather than the total, the person in front of you rather than the category they represent. None of this provides detailed instructions. Camus is not legislating. He is describing a posture, a way of standing in relation to the question of how to act that keeps certain things visible that totalizing ideologies tend to obscure. The visibility of the other person, the finitude of our own knowledge, the memory of what the rebellion was originally for. The recognition that justice pursued without limit becomes the thing it was pursuing justice against. These are not rules but orientations, and they require the ongoing exercise of judgment rather than the mechanical application of principle, which is exactly what Camus thinks ethics actually demands of anyone serious enough to attempt it. The question at the end of The Rebel is not whether to rebel. Rebellion is the only honest response to the conditions of human existence. The question is whether to rebel with memory, with the no still audible inside the yes, with the slave's original refusal still legible in the most elaborate political program built on top of it, with the person standing in front of you still visible as a person and not as an obstacle or an example. Whether to remain, after everything, a rebel rather than becoming what the rebel was rebelling against. Chapter 9. The Quarrel That Changed Everything. Paris, 1952. Two men who had been friends for nearly a decade, who had eaten together, argued together, weathered the occupation and the liberation side by side, who shared enough common ground that their disagreements had always previously found a way to remain disagreements between friends rather than declarations of war, are no longer speaking to each other. The silence between them is of the kind that Camus would have recognized from other contexts. Not the silence of the universe, which is simply indifferent, but the silence of two people who have understood each other clearly enough to know that what divides them cannot be resolved by further conversation. The Rebel had been published the previous year. It was Camus's most ambitious book, a long, historically dense examination of how rebellion becomes revolution becomes terror. Tracing the logic through the French Revolution and the Romantic Nihilists and the Russian revolutionary tradition, and arriving at the conclusion that any political movement willing to justify murder in the name of a future justice had already betrayed the values that made the rebellion worth undertaking. The argument was careful, and the scholarship was real, and the targets, though not always named, were identifiable. One of the things it was targeting was the intellectual climate of the French left, which had spent much of the post-war period finding reasons to excuse or diminish or contextualize the violence of Stalinist communism in the name of historical progress. Francis Janssen reviewed the book in Les Temps Modernes, the journal that Jean-Paul Sartre had founded and continued to edit. The review was not merely critical. It was dismissive in the specific way that academic dismissal cuts deepest, by arguing that the book was philosophically naive, that its author had failed to understand the basic terms of the debate he was entering, that the critique of revolutionary violence came from someone who had not done the serious thinking that the problem required. Camus read the review and did something unusual. He did not respond to Janssen. He wrote directly to Sartre, addressed his letter to the editor of Les Temps Modernes, and the response was a public confrontation of the kind that Parisian intellectual life in that period generated and consumed with equal intensity. Sartre's reply was long and precise, and in places devastating. He accused Camus of bourgeois moralism, of the luxury of maintaining clean hands in a world that did not permit clean hands, of positioning himself above the historical struggle in a way that amounted to complicity with the existing order. The argument, reduced to its essential terms, was this: Sartre held that historical necessity sometimes demanded revolutionary violence, that the question was not whether violence was good, but whether the alternative was worse, and that an intellectual who refused to make this calculation was refusing to take history seriously. Camus held that no historical necessity justified the murder of an actual living person, that the moment a movement began counting bodies as acceptable costs, it had lost the ethical ground that made the movement worth supporting, and that an intellectual who performed this calculation on behalf of a regime producing mass murder was not taking history seriously, but providing sophisticated cover for atrocity. The disagreement sounds, from a distance of 70 years, like a debate between two positions whose relative merits can now be assessed with the clarity that retrospect provides. But in 1952, it was not a historical question. The Soviet labor camps were real and ongoing. The show trials were recent memory. The French Communist Party, with which Sartre maintained a complicated and evolving relationship, had spent years defending or minimizing both. Camus was saying, in terms that his contemporaries could not mistake, that the French intellectual left had made itself complicit in a system that was doing to actual human beings what the ideology said it was doing on behalf of actual human beings, and that this was not a difficult moral question requiring the full weight of dialectical materialism to resolve. He was attacked from multiple directions. The Algerian question complicated his position, his refusal to endorse FLN-led independence, and his rejection of any liberation that treated civilian lives as acceptable collateral damage made him vulnerable to the charge that his universalist ethics had a convenient blind spot when it came to the specific colonial situation that had produced him. Sartre, who had no such personal stake in Algeria, could support independence without the anguish that Camus felt when he tried to think about his mother, still living in Algiers in the middle of a war. The attacks on the rebel often merged with attacks on this position, creating a portrait of Camus as a man whose principled opposition to revolutionary violence was most conveniently applied to revolutions that might threaten people he loved. Camus did not respond to these attacks as fully or as publicly as he might have. He grew quieter in the years after the quarrel. He continued to write. The short stories of L'Exil et le Royaume appeared in 1957, and he was working on The First Man when he died. But the philosophical essays that had established his reputation became less frequent. Whether this was the effect of the quarrel or of the Nobel Prize's particular kind of pressure, or simply of the ongoing Algerian situation that allowed him no comfortable position, is not something that can be determined from the outside. What is visible is that the quarrel extracted something from him that did not return. What the quarrel was actually about, beneath the literary politics and the personal bitterness and the specific historical circumstances, was a question that does not age. Whether the future can be used to excuse the present. Whether a sufficient vision of what human life might become gives those who hold the vision license to treat the people currently alive as raw material for achieving it. Sartre's position, at its most serious, was that the struggle for a more just world required accepting moral costs that a purely principled ethics could not accommodate, that refusing to accept those costs was itself a political choice and not an innocent one. Camus's position, at its most serious, was that a politics which had lost the ability to see the individual person in front of it, as a person had already become the thing it claimed to oppose, regardless of the nobility of the destination it was moving toward. The century adjudicated between them slowly, and in ways that neither would have found satisfying. The Soviet system collapsed under the weight of what it had built. The revolutionary movements that Sartre had endorsed with varying degrees of enthusiasms produced outcomes that complicated the endorsements. The argument that historical necessity justified temporary violence was tested against actual history and found to generate not the temporary violence promised, but the permanent structures of terror. That temporary violence, once institutionalized, always becomes. Camus had said this in The Rebel and been called naive for saying it, and many later readers would come to feel that the naivete had been elsewhere. But Sartre's challenge did not dissolve with the Soviet Union. The question of whether principled opposition to revolutionary violence is a form of privilege, available only to those insulated from the conditions that make revolution feel necessary, remains genuinely difficult. Camus's Mediterranean humanism, his philosophy of limits and measure, his insistence on the visible individual over the historical abstraction, is easier to hold from certain positions than from others. He knew this imperfectly in relation to Algeria. The quarrel forced him to know it more completely. And the knowledge did not produce a resolution, which is the honest outcome of a genuine philosophical disagreement. Two empty chairs at a cafe. A letter sent and a letter returned. The friendship that ended not with a single conversation, but with a review in a journal, a letter to an editor, a public exchange in which two serious minds demonstrated, with great precision and considerable heat, exactly how much they understood each other, and exactly why that understanding was not sufficient. The chairs stayed empty. The argument continued in the work of everyone who came after them, which is where arguments of that magnitude always continue, long past the point where the participants can intervene. Chapter 10. The First Man and the Last Light. A suitcase in a ditch on the side of a road in Burgundy. January 1960, the 4th day of the new year. The light already failing in the late afternoon, the way it fails in winter in that part of France. Not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily. The gray pressing down from above until the fields and the road and the bare trees become a single continuous absence of color. The car had hit a plane tree at high speed. Michel Gallimard was driving. Albert Camus died instantly. He was 46 years old, and the suitcase had been thrown clear of the wreck, and inside it, among the other papers, were 144 handwritten pages of an unfinished novel. In his coat pocket there was the unused return half of a train ticket. He had changed his plans at the last moment, had been persuaded to travel by car rather than by rail, had accepted the offer casually, in the way one accepts offers when the decision seems small. The train would have arrived in Paris on schedule. The ticket stayed in his pocket through everything that followed. A small rectangle of paper that the century has since treated as a kind of summary of the distance between the life that was lived and the life that remained to be written. The manuscript was called Le Premier Homme, the First Man. His daughter Catherine would publish it in French in 1994, 34 years after the accident, in the form in which it was found. Incomplete, annotated, the handwriting changing quality across the pages in ways that suggest different hours and different states of mind, a living document rather than a finished one. It is the most autobiographical thing Camus ever wrote. A character named Jacques Cormery travels to Algeria to find the grave of the father he never knew. The father who died at the Marne before a face could be memorized, before a voice could be stored, before any of the material that memory requires had time to accumulate. Jacques stands at the grave and looks at the dates and performs a calculation. His father was 29 when he died. Jacques is now older than his father ever was. He has lived past the man who made him, into territory the father never reached, and the gravity of this, of being the first person in a family line to have a conscious life, to read, to think, to want to understand what happened and why, is what the novel was trying to hold. The novel returns to Belcourt, to the two-room apartment without electricity, to the grandmother's authority and the mother's silence, and the specific quality of poverty that is not degradation, but simply the condition in which certain kinds of attention become possible, because the distractions that money provides are not available. It returns to Germain, the teacher who extended a hand, and to the scholarship exam, and to the world that opened afterward. It is a novel about origins, about the obligation to return to where you came from, not as nostalgia but as honesty, as the acknowledgement that the arguments were made possible by a particular set of circumstances that the arguments themselves cannot fully account for. In Stockholm, in December of 1957, Camus had stood to receive the Nobel Prize in Literature and delivered a speech that his contemporaries debated and his critics examined for contradictions, and that contains, underneath all of that, a sentence of unusual plainness. The role of the writer is not without arduous duties. By definition, he cannot be in the service of those who make history. He is at the service of those who suffer it. He was 44. He had been, by any measure, the writer his generation had produced who was most consistently in the service of those who suffered, the resistant, the poor, the condemned, the sick in Oran, the prisoner in a Saharan jail, the people whose lives the century was using as material for its experiments in total transformation. He wrote his first letter after Stockholm to Germain, the old teacher, who had paid for the materials and prepared the boy, and watched him leave Belcourt for a world that Belcourt was not supposed to produce, received the letter and kept it. It is still available to read. It contains what the Nobel speech contained, but quieter and more specific. That without you, none of this would have been possible. The formality of the prize required the public speech. The letter required only the address of a retired school teacher in Algiers and the willingness to say directly what the speech had said in the language of occasion. The sea appears in almost everything Camus wrote, not as symbol, not as metaphor for the unconscious or the infinite, or any of the things that the sea is made to stand for in literature that needs it to stand for something. As itself, that particular body of water, that specific blue, the smell of it, and the temperature of it, and the quality of light on it, on a clear afternoon in North Africa, when the summer is at its height, and the city is too hot to remain inside. The Mediterranean that Camus kept returning to in his essays, the sea that appears at the end of The Stranger, when Meursault opens himself to the gentle indifference of the world. The water that Jacques Cormery would have stood near when he returned to Algeria in the pages that were never finished. It is the same sea throughout. It is the first fact of the philosophy, before any of the arguments. A body of water that does not explain itself and does not need to, visible from the hills above Algiers on the clearest mornings of childhood. The manuscript pages that were in the suitcase in the ditch were not damaged. The accident that ended everything else left the paper intact, which is the kind of detail that resists interpretation, because it is too neat for what it is. Not a symbol, not a sign. Simply a fact about the differential fragility of different materials in the same collision. The pages survived. They were gathered and kept and eventually published, and what they show is a writer in the middle of the work, still inside the argument, still moving towards something that the accident prevented from being reached. The first man is not a conclusion. It is a direction. The light in Algeria does not arrive gradually. It appears, white and total, as it did on the morning of November 7, 1913, in Mondovi, in a world that offered very little and made no apology for it. A boy would grow up under that light and develop, in response to it and to the silence and to the sea behind the city, a philosophy that said, "The world does not answer, and this is the beginning rather than the end, and the quality of your attention to what is here, now, without promise of more. This is what you have, and it is enough." Not as consolation, as fact. The stone is still on the hillside, the boulder that will need to be pushed again in the morning, and again the morning after, without final resolution, without the summit staying won. Sisyphus descends in the last light of the afternoon, measured, unhurried, carrying in the descent everything that the philosophy arrived at. The revolt, the freedom, the passion, the solidarity that emerges when human beings in the same sealed city decide that what they owe each other is their presence and their effort. without guarantee of outcome. He descends toward the stone that is his thing. The light fades over the Mediterranean. The sea moves in its indifferent, beautiful way, holding nothing back and keeping nothing either, just moving. As it has always moved, as it will continue to move long after the arguments about it have been finished, and the people who made them have joined the silence they spent their lives examining. This is where the story rests, though the question it contains does not. What Camus found under the absurd, under the silence and the gap and the mourning, when the routine stops explaining itself, was not despair and not transcendence, but something more durable than either. The quality of attention that becomes available when you stop requiring the world to justify itself before you agree to be in it. The revolt, the freedom, the solidarity of people inside the same walls, doing what they can with what they have. For no reason beyond the fact that they are here and the work is in front of them, and to look away would be a different kind of choice. The stone goes back down, and we go back to the stone. And in the going back, in that measured, unhurried descent through the last light of the afternoon, is whatever happiness this particular way of being alive makes possible. If this made the silence feel slightly less empty tonight, stay, there is more coming. And the question to carry into whatever tomorrow brings. Not whether life has meaning, but whether the attention you bring to it is honest enough to find whatever meaning it actually contains.